Hello, I'm Nick Rabin and I'm here today with Jack Leslie, Weber Shandwicks Chairman, to talk about a new book by the Times editor James Harding called Alpha Dogs, The Americans Who Turned Political Spin into a Global Business. Now, the book looks at the rise of the US political consultancy Sawyer Miller, a firm that went on eventually to become Weber Shandwicks, and examines how they use the skills built up in the political arena and apply them to corporate communications. Now, as well as being our current chairman, Jack Leslie was also president of Sawyer Miller. Jack, according to the book, Sawyer Miller was the first firm to really realise that the whole information industry was changing, particularly television. The political context was going to have a massive impact. Although it sounds obvious now, 30 or 40 years ago, no one was doing it, were they?
Yeah, it was a sea change, a little bit like what we're going through today with the Internet. It was created by this technology of television. And I was fortunate enough to see it very early in my career when I was a political consultant, because when I was growing up, politics, at least in the United States, and this is pretty much true in Europe as well, politics were controlled by the party bosses in the smoke-filled back rooms, and they were the ones who developed the lists, and they were the ones who really dictated who would get elected and who wouldn't. And all of a sudden, television, this technology came along and allowed political candidates to bypass those parties and go directly into the living rooms of voters with their message. Now we're going through the same kind of sea change because of the Internet and a whole new era of engagement. But Sawyer Miller back then understood television, what we coined an electronic democracy, and began to practice our craft.
Many of the techniques that you at Sawyer Miller introduced, rebuttal, proactive press office, being very quick off the mark, are now an integral part of political campaigns and also any kind of corporate campaigns. But when you were trying to introduce it, was there initially a reluctance from business to take on board what they perhaps saw as something developed at Capitol Hill?
Well, there was real reluctance. I mean, the basic concepts were not as well understood. The shortness of the news cycle that you just mentioned, for example. Politicians learned early on that if you didn't respond immediately to a charge, the charge stuck. And we had ever shorter and shorter news cycles. Today, the idea of a news cycle is almost absurd because there is no cycle left. It's immediate. But back then, you wanted to be on within 24 hours at least, so you caught the first day of a news cycle. Companies were not as adept at that time in developing messages and responding and going through the necessary approval process within the corporation to be on top of their message and catch those news cycles.
A lot of corporate communications these days have got its history in political campaigning, but it's not just a one-way street. I mean, politics is learning from business nowadays, isn't it?
Well, that's true. That's true. And back, by the way, to the idea of how these companies changed, what we would say to them, I mean, in the early days, many of the corporate officials and CEOs' eyes would glaze over a little bit when we talked about this. And then people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came along, and they showed CEOs how politicians could use communications to further their agenda. And by the way, the smoke-filled back rooms that I talked about were just like the cushy boardrooms. CEOs felt that they could pretty much impose their will, and all of a sudden they had empowered employees, and they had shareholder rights groups, and they had an explosion of the business media. And so they began to realize they had to manage constituencies. Now what's happened is that all that process was going on in the 1980s and early 90s. Companies, to answer your question, became quite sophisticated in the use particularly of research to understand the behavior of consumers. And so, for example, the use of psychodemographics to really understand behavior and how people respond to different messages is something that companies learned earlier on, and in fact political campaigns began to adopt.
Just seen a very exciting and intense campaign for the Democratic presidential candidacy, and that's shown really how new techniques, I suppose, are being used across all kinds of media, particularly the internet.
Well, it's changing it dramatically. This is the sea change that I was talking about, because, and the fundamental reason why it's changing everything is the concept of engagement. In the old system, with television, for example, It's a almost a passive medium. It means that we communicate. Somebody is watching, and we hope they take away a message and behave the way we'd like to see them behave. With the internet, it's a two-way. It's a constant engagement. So political figures like Obama, who learned that technology and really adapted to it, and began to use it as a way to engage supporters and build a grassroots organization and build what has become a phenomenal fundraising organization. And they're using it to tremendous effect. And so the lessons out of this campaign, I think, very much are going to be around how to use engagement in new social media to win campaigns.
And it's, I suppose, taking it from that, it's not just saying, oh, we have to have a social media element. It's really understanding how you're going to engage with people and who you're going to engage with.
The technology is merely another platform that we use to communicate and to engage. What really is going to distinguish a firm like ours with our own clients, for example, is the level of creativity that we bring to them in finding new ways to engage people using this technology. Companies can't look at social media as just being something that I have to get involved in because it's the new thing. They should see social media as any other kind of channel that now is a new one that's available to them to engage their customers. And companies that don't do that, do it at their peril.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thanks.